Inside total containment, the mind stops trusting itself and slowly begins rewriting identity until freedom feels unfamiliar and even threatening to the individual person experiencing. Before we continue, kindly subscribe for more documentary. Human beings entering long-term confinement often discover that external control replaces internal decision-making and gradually reshapes how they interpret personal identity itself entirely. Days inside structured environments begin to erase spontaneous choice and replace it with predictable routines that eventually feel like psychological survival mechanisms over extended time. As time progresses, individuals often stop questioning authority, not because agreement exists but because resistance becomes mentally exhausting and emotionally costly in controlled institutional settings. Psychologists studying confinement have repeatedly noted that identity is not fixed and can be reshaped through environmental restriction and repetition over prolonged exposure time frames. Inside such systems, personal history begins to fade in importance while present routines dominate how individuals perceive themselves daily within structured correctional controlled environments consistently. The brain adapts quickly to limitation and begins prioritizing predictability over exploration, which fundamentally alters perception of personal agency in confined environments over time period. Repeated exposure to regulated schedules creates a psychological dependence on structure that persists even when control is removed after release from confinement institutional settings eventually. Over time, individuals may struggle to define themselves outside imposed roles, leading to confusion during reintegration into normal society. Psychological identity reconstruction challenges emerge frequently. Even small choices can feel overwhelming after prolonged restriction because decision-making capacity becomes underused and uncertain in long-term controlled environments consistently experienced. Neural pathways adjust to reduced autonomy and begin reinforcing habits that require minimal cognitive effort to maintain stability under prolonged institutional confinement conditions consistently reinforced. Researchers often describe this process as adaptation rather than damage because the mind is optimizing for survival conditions within restrictive environmental systems over extended periods. Isolation does not only affect mood but also changes how individuals interpret time, relationships, and personal continuity in prolonged segregated living environments over extended durations. With limited external feedback, people begin to rely heavily on internal narratives, which can become distorted over time in controlled isolated institutional settings, gradually evolving. The absence of varied stimulation contributes to cognitive narrowing, where identity becomes centered around survival routines under prolonged deprivation of environmental diversity conditions steadily reinforced. Behavioral adaptation inside confinement often outlasts the environment itself, influencing how people respond to freedom afterward in post-release adjustment phases over time frequently observed. Many former inmates report difficulty trusting unstructured environments because predictability once served as psychological protection during long-term incarceration. Adaptation processes commonly documented outcome studies. Time perception also shifts significantly as repetitive routines compress experiences into predictable cycles that blur memory formation within structured institutional living conditions over extended exposure. This altered sense of self is not immediate but develops gradually through repetition, control, and environmental restriction in confined regulated living environments over sustained periods. Eventually, the distinction between who a person was before confinement and who they become begins to blur after prolonged exposure to institutional control conditions experienced. Psychological research suggests identity is continuously reconstructed when external constraints override personal autonomy for extended periods within restricted behavioral environments over time. Consistently observed patterns. Some individuals adapt by internalizing rules so deeply that freedom itself can feel unfamiliar or destabilizing following extended institutional living exposure. Psychological adjustment processes often. The longer containment persists, the more the mind relies on routine as a substitute for independent decision-making within structured restrictive environments over time periods. Reintegration into society requires not only physical freedom but also psychological recalibration of identity and choice after extended institutional confinement experiences. Gradual adaptation required process. This transition can be one of the most difficult human adjustments because internal systems lag behind external change during post-incarceration psychological recovery. Commonly reported. Ultimately, self-perception is shaped less by environment itself and more by the duration of enforced structure under prolonged controlled living conditions. Systematically reinforced patterns. We begin to see identity not as a fixed trait but as something continuously shaped by surroundings and repetition in environments of sustained control systems. By the time release arrives, many individuals discover the hardest battle was never physical confinement but the silent reshaping of identity within it itself completely. After release, many individuals expect immediate relief but instead encounter unfamiliar psychological friction as freedom introduces overwhelming complexity. After years of structured confinement experience it. The outside world demands constant decision-making, and this sudden requirement often overwhelms individuals whose cognitive patterns have adapted to predictable institutional routines over time. Simple choices like what to eat or where to go can trigger anxiety because autonomy has been reduced through long-term structured environmental conditioning process. Many report feeling detached from their own identity, as if the self they once knew has become distant after prolonged institutional behavioral adaptation processes occurred. This disconnection is not immediate but develops gradually as the brain continues applying survival strategies learned during extended periods of enforced structure over time. Even after release, the nervous system remains tuned to predictability, causing discomfort in situations that require spontaneous judgment or flexible thinking in real-world settings. Researchers describe this as a form of institutional adaptation where behavior becomes optimized for constraint rather than freedom itself over extended periods of time occur. The transition to freedom can therefore feel like entering a different psychological environment where previously useful coping mechanisms no longer function effectively in practice now. Time perception also shifts significantly because repetitive routines compress experiences, making days feel indistinguishable and weakening long-term memory formation processes over time cycles occur. In many cases, individuals struggle with trust in unstructured environments because predictability once served as a form of psychological protection mechanism during institutional life period. Neural pathways reinforced by repetition can persist long after confinement ends, influencing behavior patterns in subtle ways that individuals may not immediately recognize over time. Freedom itself may initially feel disorienting because the mind has adapted to limitation as a stabilizing structure rather than a constraint in psychological terms. Still, some individuals report difficulty making simple decisions after release because cognitive systems trained for compliance no longer provide clear guidance in daily life now contexts. This can lead to anxiety and hesitation in everyday situations where freedom requires rapid evaluation and personal responsibility for outcomes without external structure present consistently. Over time, many individuals reconstruct identity by adopting new routines that mimic the structure once provided by confinement systems for psychological stability needs in recovery. This rebuilding process is often slow because identity formed under constraint does not immediately adapt to open environments without friction during transition periods now experienced. Psychologists emphasize that identity is not fixed but continuously shaped by environment, repetition, and duration of exposure in controlled settings over sustained time exposure cycles. Even months after release, traces of institutional thinking can remain embedded, influencing choices and emotional responses in subtle ongoing ways long after transition ends. The most difficult adjustment is not physical freedom but relearning how to choose without external structure guiding every action in unstructured daily environments now again. This explains why reintegration into society can feel overwhelming even when external conditions are completely safe and supportive overall after long-term confinement release period. Identity reconstruction continues long after release because the mind slowly unlearns dependency on structured routines over extended time during post-incarceration adaptation phase process continues. Ultimately, self-perception remains fluid, shaped by environment, repetition, duration, and the brain's ongoing adjustment to freedom itself after extended institutional exposure ends gradually now. What looks like freedom externally is often a psychological transition that unfolds slowly inside the mind over time beyond physical release conditions still continues now. The true prison does not always end at release because the mind carries its learned architecture into freedom long after confinement itself remains within us.